Good evening. Welcome to our first Energion Tuesday night hangout of the new year. And for the first hangout of the new year, I have as a guest one of our earliest authors. This last August was 12 years of Energion in business. So that gives us 6 months more after that. And in the new year, we're going to be producing quite a number of new books. Elgin and I will talk a little bit about what we have done, what he's working on especially. And we're just going to play this kind of by ear and welcome everybody back to our New Year's project. So good evening, Elgin.
Good evening. It's nice to be here.
Okay, well, let me start with a little bit of this history, because your involvement with Energion goes back, I guess, before there was an Energion to be involved with.
Well, the involvement with you certainly goes back that far.
Well, if we went back involvement with me, that goes back to the good old CompuServe Religion Forum back in the days when there was no internet, or at least not available to us, and you called the CompuServe on the phone and left messages for one another. So I'm not sure that constitutes going back a fair ways these days, I think.
Probably going back to visit.
Yeah, we might want to get off of this subject pretty quick here. And let me let everybody know that I do have, it's the live chat app is up. That's how you can get in questions or comments. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll have the opportunity there on the page with the viewer to chat and get involved. But actually, the thing that I was thinking about that got us started before Energion was there was your first edition of the Consider Christianity, which was one book at that time that I had read, and I remember recommending it to a few especially college students of my acquaintance as a way to bone up on the general arguments about Christianity. And I think I got like the last box of them that you had, or something like that. All of them were passed out eventually, and this is really before I'd started the company. And then it's probably just a couple of years after I started the company that we started in on the next edition. Consider Christianity is 2 volumes. Let me pop up these covers while we're at it here. And everybody, this is going to be relatively informal. If I hit that, I think now everybody should have the cover of Evidence for the Bible. This is what we did. Evidence for the Bible was volume 1. And this is talking particularly about arguments for and against the reliability and inspiration of Scripture. And we can comment a little bit more on what Elgin argues and doesn't argue if we have the time. Let me pop up the other cover now. Hold on just a second. And then the second book is Christianity and Secularism, which is volume 2, which goes down to, I guess the term we could say, philosophical level of argument, and philosophical and scientific, that sort of argument, and in particular how Christianity impacts the culture.
It also tends to deal a lot with the opposite worldview, competing worldview today of secularism, and how the two are contrast, and how Christianity is often misrepresented by the culture at large.
And then that's one of the reasons that I was recommending it. A few people asked me, and I'll use this as a springboard to say, make a few comments about the books, is a few people would ask me when I was giving out the first edition, is you read that, and Elgin, you talk quite differently than I do. And which is really the reason I was giving out your book. Because essentially what you do is go through these arguments one at a time, and how shall I say, the books, would you consider it fair for me to say they're data driven?
I think so. Yeah, they're very much data and argument driven. As you know, but maybe some of the people listening don't. I started my teens. I hate to say my life, because when I was born, I didn't have an opinion. But at some point between birth and my teenage years, I became an atheist. And so from my teenage years to my early 20s, I was a committed atheist, what might actually be called nowadays a neo-atheist, as I was somewhat antagonistic towards Christianity. But over a period of time, God was very patient with me, and I became a Christian. And as a brand new Christian, all of those arguments I had with Christians were very much on my mind. And I looked for some source material, and I found either compilations by people like Josh McDowell, or some other apologetics books, which they seem more written by Christians for Christians, and not written for people who actually had problems and questions. So I basically took my life experience, what little there was of it up to that point, I'm talking about the early 80s now, and began to write what was then one volume, essentially laying out the case for Christianity in a very systematic way, not outline format as you might find in a Josh McDowell, but hopefully more readable, and more directed towards the person with questions as opposed to the already committed believer. And then you saw that and approached me, and that's when we decided to do a revision of it, which ended up becoming large enough to make it into 2 separate volumes.
It's an interesting thing for the history of Energion that yours was the second book that I picked up. That was one that I had been using, but was out of print. As I don't know, I'm joking about saying that I got your last box, but I wasn't very far from your last box. There weren't a lot of them left when I got that, and I gave all of those out. And that was also true of the book "Who's Afraid of the Old Testament God" by Alden Thompson. Again, this is one that I've used frequently in teaching the Old Testament, encouraging people to study the Old Testament, and it was out of print. And in his case, I know I did buy the last of them that were available. I bought off of him and was using them in my own teaching. The thing that I want to say to people about these 2 books is simply, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach, how shall I say, sharing and defending the faith. And those 2 things overlap a great deal. And a lot of people are very uncomfortable with the detailed arguments. And sometimes you can have different answers. I remember giving a talk to some people about the genealogies of Jesus in Luke and Matthew, and I had probably, in the course of the discussion, talked about half a dozen different views on how to relate the 2 genealogies. And somebody at the end comes up and asks me, but what is the real answer? What's really true? Well, I could give my opinion, but there are different ways of explaining it. And where I found the problem with Christians was not being aware of the question. Because you were aiming at others. I was giving these mostly to Christians who were asking the questions, especially college students. You leave Sunday school, most of these questions haven't come up in Sunday school. and there you are. And the problem is not just having the answers, but first of all, having the questions honestly asked. If you don't realize the question exists and you don't realize that there are proposed answers, you're in a pretty bad way in any conversation about your faith.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the problems we find is sometimes we don't have all the information we like. And therefore we have questions where, there may be 2 or 3 different options and we don't have enough data to say in particular which one it is. I don't see that as a problem. I don't expect the biblical accounts to be so detailed. I mean, people complain the Bible's too long as it is, and how many have actually read it cover to cover? To be able to answer every single question without raising new ones would be very, very difficult. So that we can say, well, it could be one of these 3 or 4 or 5 possibilities. We don't have enough information to say which one it is. For me, that's sufficient, especially since a lot of these issues are dealing with, issues, for example, exactly what time was the crucifixion? There's a couple of different ways to answer that. Really, from a Christian's point of view, the exact time is not as critical as the fact that it actually happened. So, but we can get lost in some of these details, which is really what it is. It's important to answer because the critics raise them and we have to be able to address the critics. But, that's all we can really do. Hold on a second. Okay, took care of that.
Well, I think the weakness comes in, and this is where I would commonly hand your book to somebody, was in saying somebody has just been hit with a question of when did the crucifixion really occur? When did it happen? And they don't realize that there's a question.
Yeah.
And then that is a place of vulnerability because you haven't even heard the option that maybe the precise moment of the crucifixion is not as major of an issue as your questioner is making it seem.
And this isn't to say that there's any sort of error or problem in the Bible. It's just the nature of eyewitness testimony that people are focusing on what's important, particularly when you take an eyewitness testimony and then you summarize it in an account like the Gospels. People are going to emphasize different things and may not provide the full detailed minute-by-minute transcript, particularly in a culture that is not interested by minute-by-minute accounts. I mean,
okay, let me get you to just lay one thing out for people kind of briefly. You believe in biblical inerrancy, the doctrine, I would say, according to the Chicago Statement, would probably be the safe way to say that. But at the same time, evidence for the Bible is not about proving biblical inerrancy.
No, and I deliberately don't try to prove it for the simple reason is that it is largely a statement of faith in the sense that to be able to prove inerrancy, you'd have to have far more knowledge than we have. When I'm talking to Christians, I'll mention that I believe in inerrancy. If they really want to discuss or debate it, I'll have the discussion and the debate with them. But I don't really force that. I don't push it. When I'm talking to non-Christians, I never argue for inerrancy. I argue for reliability because I can prove reliability, or let me say I don't like the word prove. I can demonstrate reliability and put it into a context where we can discuss what's relevant. Inerrancy isn't required for faith. It happens to be a belief I hold, but it's not required to be a Christian by any means. And it's certainly not required to prove or to demonstrate the Bible's message is something that must be considered and dealt with. And that's the key point. If we get lost in talking to a skeptic about inerrancy, they have to only deal with one particular fact that I can't completely answer to their satisfaction to say that, oh, I can ignore what Christians say. On the other hand, if I'm dealing with a skeptic and I can show reliability, then they have to deal with the message that's being presented, i.e. the gospel, whether they can nitpick here or there, or they can't give the 100% answer as to, say, the exact time or the sequence of events that happened on the morning of the resurrection. There's 3 or 4 different ways to actually put the gospel narratives into chronological order. We don't know exactly which one is correct. But when you start looking at the reliability of the evidence for the resurrection, that is very solid, very reliable, and it presents the skeptic with something that they must deal with, even if it is to reject it. But it's much more difficult to reject the reliability of the New Testament and its message than it is to argue for inerrancy.
And we live our lives pretty much on sources that are not in fact inerrant and do quite well, such as a police officer investigating a crime does not require inerrant eyewitnesses, and most certainly won't find them.
Yeah.
But we'll combine that testimony. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that on evidence for the Bible.
I would point out also real quick, sort of in closing, that even in sources we consider completely reliable, we routinely accept differences that in the biblical narrative would be criticized and taken as reason to reject them. For example I commonly use is the assassination of President Kennedy. You read history books about it, and they will mention that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. But then you go and read news events and contemporaneous accounts at the time, and they will point out that not only was Kennedy assassinated, but Conley was shot at the same time. Well, does that make the history books that don't mention Conley in error? Of course not. History books summarize. But such summaries in the biblical text are suddenly taken as major errors because one account mentioned 2 beggars, another account only mentioned 1, and they take it as, then therefore one of the accounts must be wrong.
So there may be a point there in not making excessive claims.
Yes.
I recall being handed a book on measurements. It was ancient measurements that referred to the dimensions of the Great Pyramid measured down to 1,000th of a millimeter and this was after estimating the amount of plaster that would have covered it, which had all been, according to the author, had been lost. And the problem then is when you state your measurement to some ridiculous level, that tends then to, how shall I say, diminish the weight of the rest of your message.
Well, it's like one of the common, quote, contradictions in the Bible or errors in the Bible is the supposed, in Kings it mentions the bronze bowl at the front of the temple, and supposedly if you take the measurements in the Bible, it comes out with a bad value for pi.
Yeah, it comes out with 3 even.
Right, but you can't do that simply because of rounding errors, and there's something in science about your precision of your answer can be no greater than the precision of your measurements going in. And yet, if you calculate pi to a single digit, which is what you have for their measurements, you get exactly the correct value. It's only the critic argues that you should be able to calculate it out more than you can. So a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense when you put it into context and you actually examine it. But to someone who's not encountered the question, to go finally back to where you started, if they've never heard that there was a problem with the value of pi in the Bible, then suddenly a skeptic comes up and says, well, calculates the wrong value for pi, and they're not familiar with the scientific issues of precision and accuracy. Yeah, it could shake someone's faith.
Yeah, because you have an expectation there that the Bible is supposed to be telling you the value of pi, you know, besides precision, you can ask the question of, you know, was the thing actually 100% round? You know, you say you have all kinds of possibilities in there. Okay. While we're at that, I will mention one of the reasons that I consider it important to publish books like Evidence for the Bible is I think it's extremely important for us as Christians to think about both what the Bible is, the inspiration, how it comes to us, but also how we're going to understand it, because understanding, you know, the way we do think about these things and the interpretation that we apply to them has a tremendous impact on the result. And if we don't think about it, then we end up kind of floating along and don't really know where we actually are. So when somebody comes back and says, well, here's a line out of the Bible that I've read and it doesn't make any sense, if you haven't thought about how is it that you study a passage, what do you look at? If you haven't thought about that, then you're kind of lost in that conversation. So that's critical, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to see if before we're done, I do want to mention your books that have to do with politics. Since we're here in the United States anyway, had the opening of the new Congress today, and we're just a couple of weeks here now from the inauguration of a new president. So I will hold up your books on that. But before we go to that, you're working on topical line drive, or rather, you're pretty much done working on a topical line drive. What we're going to do with that, and I'll kind of open this first, and then you can expand. Working from largely Christianity and secularism is a basic, what is Christianity? This would be then in 12,000 words about.
Yeah, quite a task. I basically take one of the chapters in Christianity and secularism, a chapter that describes some of the basic teachings of Christianity, and then I expand on that to it also talks about how do we arrive at that. It addresses the question of can we actually understand the Bible, deals with common complaints that, you know, it's so Bible's so open to interpretation, it's meaningless, and nobody really knows what it says, that type of deal. But I also expand on the question of what does it really mean to be a Christian? This is something we hear a lot about in society. You know, we hear claims that the United States is or is not a Christian nation, that this particular group is or is not Christian. And what are we actually saying when we're saying that? And how should we think about such questions? Because it really, you know, there you get nice and logical and say it's the fallacy of equivocation because you're actually using Christianity, the word, in several different connotations and meanings. But I basically go through that process and talk about, after talking about the four basic areas like God, Jesus Christ, salvation in the Bible, right, then start asking the question is, you know, are people who disagree with some or all those, are they Christian? Are they not Christian? Are Mormons Christian? You know, these types of questions, and basically break it down as to how to approach them. Because we really are, when you say a group is Christian, is that the same thing as saying the individuals in that group are Christian? That's some of the questions I deal with.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's an important thing, although in one sense, in terms of discourse, in terms of discussion, that issue is a matter of definition. If you give a list of criteria, here's what we're going to consider Christian, then you'd have the other question, which people like to ask is, can a Mormon be saved?
Or equivocation comes in. Yeah. That's the equivocation, because there really are two different meanings to Christian.
Yeah. Well, and I get the same equivocation with regard to my Seventh-day Adventist background. Was I raised or was I not raised as a Christian growing up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church?
Yeah.
In both of those questions, and you get that kind of equivocation, with in the same way. I recall in this county somebody saying in one conversation with me equivocating, because the question was, why should evolution be taught in the public schools? Their answer was, our county is 90% Christian. Now let's ignore, because we could all debate all the issues there. I'm only interested in the equivocation in this conversation. And I said, but I'm a Christian and I accept the theory of evolution. At which point they say, well, you can't be a Christian and accept the theory of evolution. So you have immediately, so I said, well, then if that's the case, then there are less than 90% Christians in the county, because some of those Christians that you put under your 90% accept the theory of evolution. And all within one sentence, and the conversation went south from there.
Well, it usually does, and hopefully it will not go south in my book. But
well, but it's one of the reasons I like having that discussed, is because once you think about these things, I think it's always better to have somebody have thought about these things than coming at them cold.
Yes.
So that you realize.
That's where I think we lose a lot. It's well-known statistics that the percentage of teenagers in church youth groups versus the percentage of those who are Christian by age 21, there's a massive drop-off, at least in terms of church attendance and being connected to the faith, upwards of 80%, which is detailed in one of your other books by one of your other authors.
Yeah, Kevin Brown's
right.
Rite of Passage for the Home and Church,
which is a wonderful book that I would recommend people read, particularly if they have people, children who are approaching the teenage years or in the teenage years. But a large part of the problem is they go off into colleges. Not the only problem, but it's one of the problems, and where they get hit with arguments that they had never encountered before, and there's usually no one nearby that can help them work through the issues or see the problems. And we have a tremendous drop off at that point. People whose faith is destroyed simply because there was no one that they could reach out to. And this is not a new problem. There's an elderly lady I know who has been influenced by my books and my writings, and she read, when she was in her 20s, she read some very critical works, but when she went to her church, instead of answering the questions, they basically told her she shouldn't even ask the questions. She should just have faith. And that wasn't sufficient for her, and as a result, she had trouble. She told me once she just wished she had encountered somebody like me when she was much younger, before she had decades of doubt and criticism seep into her way of looking at Christianity.
Okay, let's go ahead, if you don't mind, run just a few minutes over here, because this is a good subject. I wanted to ask another question here.
Sure.
It would seem to me, and when I was teaching youth, I did, that it would be valuable to bring up the questions and discuss them when the kids are teenagers, when they're in the youth group and in the youth Sunday school class, and you can sit down and ask them. I gave any number of copies of your book to college students, and incidentally, the college students, even though sometimes we'd discuss and they'd find out that you and I come to different conclusions, that didn't reduce their appreciation for the book or for the discussion, because they were looking for the willingness to address the questions.
Yeah. Too often we're either conditioned directly or even indirectly that to have faith means that you don't ask the questions. That if you are asking faith, or if you're having doubts, or you even having just questions, that's somehow unspiritual because it demonstrates a lack of faith. But that's the opposite of what the Bible teaches. Paul told us to test everything, hold on to the good. Well, we can't test unless we have the questions to ask. And it's not, it's not the ostrich approach. If we stick our head in the sand and ignore the questions, they're still being asked. They're being asked by the people we're trying to witness to. They're being basically asked and answered by our opponents in the culture. And so at least having a familiarity with the answers and the approach, it doesn't mean everyone has to be a walking encyclopedia apologetics, but they should be at least generally familiar with the broad outlines, and more importantly, know where to go to get the answers when the questions are raised. I think another aspect of this is simply some people are so unconnected with the culture and the sort of the debate about Christianity that they're afraid they're going to get an answer that, if I ask the question, I might not ask where the answer takes me type approach. And so they sort of avoid those questions simply because they're scared to ask them. And having taught a number of classes on apologetics, it's one of the things I warn on the first night is, as you enter into this, realize that we're going to be asking questions that you may find uncomfortable and didn't even realize were there. Yeah. I encourage them to stick the class out, because by the end of the class, we have answered them hopefully in a satisfactory means. And usually the people walk away actually much more confirmed in their faith than they were coming in, because they've sort of seen the criticisms and seen how weak they are, and it actually ends up bolstering their faith, having seriously confronted the questions and understand how they're being asked and some of the underlying assumptions behind them. But for those who've never done that, it's a little scary to venture in that this core belief that you have, that people are actually questioning it, and smart people are questioning it. And if you don't feel like you have the ability to answer it, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just to hide and pretend it's not there.
Yeah, if people don't talk about, if that's the problem in church. And I mean, I'd get asked this with the young people sometimes is, surely you shouldn't bring up these issues because you're creating doubts. And that's where I disagree wholeheartedly. If the question is being asked somewhere, you need to be honest about it in church. Got a line from, just in December, we released a new edition of my friend Alden Thompson's book, Inspiration, Hard Questions, Honest Answers. One of his lines in the preface to that book is that he wrote the book because he got tired of people losing their faith because they found things in their Bible that they didn't think were supposed to be there. And, which is a little bit of the point that we're talking about, is that you want to not be afraid of digging deeper because of what might occur and what's there. I was going to add one thing too. I've emphasized a little bit disagreeing, but I know from our discussions, I'd probably say if you did your little nice circular Venn diagrams, there's overlapping range in yours and my answer to pretty much everything that we're discussing. When you talk about these details, we may, I'm certain that we do come to different conclusions on specific texts, but acceptable answers, I think we usually find an overlapping area where they touch. So it's easy to overemphasize. One of the good reasons I have to emphasize that is I really like having material that people can hear different people who are still saying, yes, Jesus is Lord, and hear them answer the questions. And then you can go ahead and do that. You don't have to understand the genealogies the way I do.
No. And I think it goes back to the whole concept of communication and inspiration and inerrancy. I believe in inerrancy, but one of the reasons I'm not that concerned about it is, when you have a communication, you have the sender, you have the source, the means of transmission, the receiver, and then the recipient, right? Well, in that long chain, if you apply that to the Bible, the sender is God, the basically the transmitter is the apostle, the means of transmission is the text, the receiver is our reading of it, and we finally then decide what we think it means at the end. Well, I can believe God is inerrant, and I do believe it is inerrant. I believe the apostles were inspired, and the prophets were inspired in inerrancy. And I believe the transmission of the text is inerrant. But that whole process at the end that involves me, which is the Bible study and then the attempt to understand it, to me, that's where a lot of errors can definitely creep in. So I believe in the inspiration and inerrancy of the text. I do not believe in the inerrancy of my ability to understand the text.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes people confuse their understanding with the inspiration of God, and therefore when they find out that one of their understandings of a text is incorrect, it leads them to question the Bible as opposed to question their particular method of study or lack thereof, or whatever the numerous possible error sources that could have crept in.
Okay. Well, since we've run like 8 minutes over, but I do want to mention your books that relate to politics as we're going. So we'll give just a couple of minutes. I'm going to hold up here. This is the paperback. This is actually the second expanded edition of Preserving Democracy. And so you'll notice this is paperback. I just want to, because I had it on my shelf, this was originally issued as a hardcover with a jacket, which we have. This is the last actually completely brand new hardcover copy that I have. So what I'm going to do, we'll let Elgin comment briefly on Preserving Democracy. But if anybody within, say, the next 3 days, the first person to email me and ask for it, I will send them the first edition hardcover of Preserving Democracy free. So all you have to do is email me. You get pubs@energion.com, henry@energion.com, either one. I'll go ahead and try to put a link in this thing soon, after it's released, and I'll send you the hardcover free. It's missing a wonderful 10th chapter where Elgin gets to tell everybody, and I was right after all.
Well, that book
is still hardcover with a dust jacket.
That book came out of discussions that I was having with a lot of my students. I was teaching critical thinking, and in the process of teaching critical thinking, I would encourage discussion and debate within the class, and obviously it oftentimes ended up with discussions about current events and current issues. And it was sort of surprising to me how uninformed people were about the founding of this country and the general issues of democracy and the republic and how you govern. It was their views were very superficial, I thought. So I ended up writing the book. Basically, the subtitle says a lot about what the book is really about. It's definitely within the political realm, but the subtitle is "What the Founding Fathers Knew, What We Have Forgotten, and How It Threatens Democracy." And the underlying premise is we are constantly making changes to how we run the country, but the founding fathers put together a system of government that was very well thought out and very well informed, based on the running of governments, and in particular of democracies, from Greece to Rome to Venice, up through time. And so when they put together the Constitution, they tried to come up with something with checks and balances and trade-off to try and make a government that would last and basically overcome all the previous problems that democracies inherently have. And when we make changes today, are we getting rid of extraneous things that are no longer valid in the 21st century? Or are we removing key foundational supports that actually have a very functional role in preserving the democracy. And how do we know the difference? So that's basically the background to the book. I tried to write it initially as nonpartisan as I could, and I've got the introductions are one's by a liberal, one's by a moderate, and one's by a conservative. And all three found the book very enjoyable. Now, which is not to say they all agreed with everything I wrote. Probably nobody does. I'm not sure I agree with everything I wrote. I was certainly wrong in the fact that I was thinking that we were looking at problems that were much further out, and I think a lot of people today look at our system and say there's definitely some problems that need addressing. You can say Trump was elected as a reaction, or Trump is systematic of the problems, however you want to particularly view it. But I think the problems are there, and unless we have a good understanding of why our government was constructed the way it was and what some of the key issues that we're facing are, it's unlikely that we will actually have a coherent solution that will make things better.
Okay, well, let me just bring that to you. The book is $14.99. That's the current paperback edition. It's in stock on Amazon.com. By the way, while I was checking that, the Amazon still has one of the hardcovers in stock. So you can pay $30 for it, or you can email me and get yourself a free copy. And while we're at that,
it's also available by ebook.
Yes, that one is on ebook. This one is on ebook as well, only $2.99, and the print is only $5.99. What is wrong with social justice? So you can read Elgin for a little bit less than $30 or $15. And I should mention, Evidence for the Bible is available both Kindle and on a number of the EPUB platforms such as iTunes and Google Play. And Christianity and Secularism will be shortly. It's not available right now, but it's very close. So just to let you know what's going on. And we'll be follow our news blog at Energion.com. Energion.co and Energion.com are both go to the same site. You can see that down at the bar below my face here. And if you subscribe to our news channel, you'll hear when other books by Elgin and other authors are being released. Now, only a mere 14 minutes over time. We'll call it to a close. Thanks a lot for joining me, Elgin, and good evening all.